mayors who are in the room,
Other mayors.
or other mayors who are coming in. Communities for Local Democracy. Please feel free to just pull some chairs around if you'd like, so that you've all got access to the microphones. We do have some spare seats over here. We can take the maybe the clerks could take the name tags away, and we can have some of our mayors sitting here. Please do come and sit down and make the most of having the table and the microphones if you'd like to. Thank you. Thank you for all travelling today. It's great to see you. We have read your submission, and I'm going to use my chair prerogative to allow you 15 minutes. So please, that will just include a question time, and we would like most of it to please be on our questions. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you on this bill. My name is Helen Worboys, and I'm the Mayor of the Manawatu District, but more importantly today I'm here as the Chair for Communities for Local Democracy. Communities for Local Democracy is a coalition of 31 territorial and unitary authorities. Representatives of these councils are here with us today. Unfortunately, not all of our members were able to travel today due to the change of the hearing date. To my left is Mayor Dan Gordon, the Mayor of the Waimakere District Council, and also the Deputy Chair for Communities for Local Democracy. Assisting us today to address any technical questions are Malcolm Alexander, our Project Manager, and Andreas Heuser from Castalia. Andreas is the author of the 2 substantive appendices in our submission. Our submission is extensive, and I encourage you to read the detail carefully. We have 7 key points to make before opening it up to questions. Firstly, Communities for Local Democracy agrees with the need to reform the Three Waters sector to ensure that investment occurs at the right place and at the right time. However, we argue strongly that any reform should follow standard utility reform processes, which respects property rights and gives real weight to local decision-making, voice and input. Our alternative models will deliver real change appropriate for each council's local challenges and achieve the outcomes that government is also wanting to achieve without needing to take our community assets. C4LD supports the involvement of mana whenua in the Three Waters decision-making. Our position statement on iwi Māori partnership in the context of Three Waters reform is attached in Appendix 7 to our written submission. This position allows for the local arrangements between councils and mana whenua to be co-designed locally as appropriate, so they are more direct and more meaningful. The usual approach to utility reform is to set rigorous regulatory standards and then actually enforce them. The role of the asset owner is to meet these standards, knowing that real and effective enforcement will occur if the owner does not. This creates, in turn, a very real and effective incentive to reform water service delivery, but which also allows local approaches to local issues within the broader national regulatory umbrella. For this reason, we do support the government's changes to the broader regulatory regime. We accept that there should be some time limits on councils to comply or face consequences. This was the recommendation of the Productivity Commission report to the government. This creates a further incentive on asset owners to evolve into a structure that will meet the regulatory standards in a timely manner. Castalia's modelling shows that the planned capital expenditure in the sector is able to be funded for the next 20 years, and beyond that with only the modest of price increases. Accordingly, the four mega entity balance sheet separation is simply not necessary. Other structural alternatives do exist and will effectively address the core problem. Appendix 6 sets out these alternatives in some details. So we ask you to read Appendix 6 carefully and ask searching questions of your officials. The policy work underpinning this bill is based on extremely poor problem definition. This is a result of bad evidence, poor assumptions, and poor process. Appendix 5 sets this out clearly. And again, please read Appendix 5 and ask searching questions of your officials. And finally, the Crown does not own the three water assets in question. This bill will take these community assets without compensating the present community owners of the assets for this confiscation of property. Clause 166 of the bill specifies that the rights of property ownership and then removes these rights. One cannot own anything if you do not have the right to make decisions concerning it, and one size certainly does not fit all.
Well, can I firstly acknowledge the Chair and members of the Select Committee? Loss of control and real influence is the crux and real issue for our communities. At times of civil defence emergencies, having the ability to influence how staff and contractors are deployed to protect our community is crucial. We know we have very real experience, on the ground experience, in earthquakes and now regular weather events that leads to flooding. You only have to look at recent weather events, particularly in Nelson and Marlborough, to see that. Under the entity-based model, this lack of control and influence is a serious concern for our councils and our communities. When times are tough, communities want to see a local face who knows and understands them, not an unknown and distant bureaucrat. It's our view there is a better and more durable way to deliver Three Waters reform than the model contained in the bill. Communities for Local Democracy considers the alternative approach outlined in some detail in our submission is the way to do this. We ask you to consider this seriously. It's not too late to turn this around, for the government to genuinely partner with councils and communities to achieve reform that everyone can agree with. We believe our alternative model is one that could achieve bipartisan political support. This would ensure that any reform is enduring. And reform, as important as this is, it should be. Rushed reform is in no one's interest. We are happy to take any questions, both orally now or in writing later if we run out of time. And thank you for the offer of additional time, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to start with the Honourable David Bennett and then we'll go to Helen White.
Thank you for your submission. We had an earlier submission saying that what's happening here is basically giving away rights of water that had previously been held by nobody or everybody. What's your view on that? Do you think that this legislation is a de facto way of achieving ownership of water?
We haven't looked at that particular aspect per se. We've been very, very careful to distinguish the issue, the very real issue that the Crown and iwi have to determine under the treaty about the rights and interests of water, from the infrastructure that moves it around and treats it, which is not Crown property, which is post-treaty. And so we're dealing with that aspect of it, not the ownership of the thing that flows from it and treats it and returns it to the environment.
Helen White, question.
Thank you. We have had some really interesting submissions today, and one of them was from a group that is a forum that has specialists on it, has a biologist that has an auditor. They raised some really serious concerns that are about councils effectively sweeping a lot of the problems under the table and actually visiting the cost of that on ratepayers. So it's a strong challenge to what you're saying. They're saying that a lot of that information is just not being told to the public. They've got one example, which is 560 toilets costing 27 million in New Plymouth. They're talking about the failure of the Wanganui wastewater system. They're talking about a bridge that was built and it was actually 3 years later completely redundant because of the plans that the council had for roading in the area. I'd like you to talk about that. Those things are very real. Obviously, we've had the deaths in Havelock North as well. How can we trust that this system, as it has been going on, is effective with all that information before us?
The first point to make, I think, is that we are not saying the current system is effective, quite the contrary, which is why we say Three Waters needs reform. The two examples you've cited, both the Havelock North event and the environmental side, point to the poor state of the regulatory environment. Regulation is of no importance whatsoever unless you enforce it and you are known and effective, and that the asset owners on the other side of the ledger know it will be enforced and know that there will be consequences. I would argue quite strongly that Havelock North is not a failure of local government, it is a failure of the Crown for failing to discharge its regulatory obligation. And that is why the Ministry of Health is no longer the regulator. Similarly, on the environmental side, it has been very clear for many years that the role of regional councils and unitaries is to enforce the rules. That they do not is on them, not the owners of the assets. We would agree that had they done their jobs, both at the Crown level and the regional council level, then the incentive would have been on asset owners to make those improvements that are necessary. Instead, we find ourselves in this position and we are where we are. We would agree with you, if you're going to have a regulatory standard, you must enforce it, which is why we're saying start there.
And that's why we support Te Mata Arawai. Absolutely critical in this process.
Thank you. Simon Court. You're on mute, Simon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Malcolm, and to the mayors. I just want to ask a question about the economic modelling that sits behind the government's reform proposal. We've heard various estimates, 120 to 180 billion dollars over the next 30 years. That would be a 3 times increase in investment. And it's not quite clear how that money would be spent, what it would be spent on, even if it's necessary. And I also want to ask you, could you reflect on the justifications for the average household water charges over the next 20 to 30 years and the difference between, say, your modelling and the WICS modelling?
I can respond to that. So the $185 billion is a hypothetical number that is looking at all 67 councils, assuming no change, assuming some pretty poor performance, whereas even since 2017, there has been significant investment, improvement in regulation. So WICS doesn't even assume that that regulation has any impact on performance. So it's a hypothetical. We're focused on the money that will actually be spent, that they actually say will be spent under their model, so $97 billion, which lines up with what the Infrastructure Commission says is needed, and which is what also councils, which are the asset owners, say is needed in their long-term plans. So that very rigorous process to estimate what's needed. So we focus on that, and $90 to $97 billion. Our financial modelling says without changing water charges or changing any of the financing conditions, so council debt caps, that $97 billion is financeable over 20 years without changing your settings. And of course, you can change settings. You could account for modest increases in bills, or you could change the financing conditions and make it financeable for longer. On the average household bill, so the question there was, well, we're saying in our modelling, like you wouldn't have to change anything and it would be entirely financeable for 20 years. But recognise that with increased standards, costs will go up, and that has to be funded and paid for somehow.
Thank you. We have a supplementary from Rachel Brooking.
Yes, thank you. Actually, my supplementary is back on Helen White's question, and that was in your answer then you were talking about the importance of good regulatory systems and that they haven't always been what people have wanted or thought that they should be. Totally agree with that point about the importance of enforcement action. Just wondering then, when regulators have started to take enforcement action, are there any examples of councils complaining about that, or do you say that councils have never complained about any potential regulatory enforcement?
Well, in terms of drinking water, I'm unaware that the Ministry of Health ever took an enforcement action. There may have been one or two, but if it's in distant history. So, and that, being from a public health perspective is pretty lamentable, to be frank.
Sure. And the RMA?
And the RMA, that from time to time there has, as I understand, been points of difference around consenting to that, but that goes to whether you believe the regulator means what it says or not. Now, so the regulatory
Sorry, I'm just going to stop with you. Helen White, could you please turn your microphone off? I'm not sure if it's you, it might be someone down the back, but please carry on.
Yeah, so and that depends, where was I? Where it depends on whether the authority in this case, or the asset owner around probably wastewater assets in this case, believes that the regulator, who happens to be another council in this instance, but which is not part of Three Waters, I might add. It is from our point of view, it is essentially part of the Crown regulatory environment, albeit delegated down. Whether you believe they take action. The fact that they haven't taken action, irrespective of whether a particular TA or unitary talking to itself believes it or not, is reflective of the state of the regulatory environment. Now, I come from an infrastructure background, the electricity and gas industries. I never doubted for a microsecond that the regulators in those areas would take action if we did not comply, because there's health and safety issues involved and so on. And as a result, that was factored into your asset and business planning and your investment profile, and that because we knew that was deadly serious. What we have here is a failure. And so this is part of the failure of the problem definition that we're talking about here. What you need to do is think about, how do I improve those regulatory incentives? How do I ensure that councils move with the program, knowing that's why we support the Productivity Commission's idea of a backstop regulatory intervention. So this is not taking your foot off the accelerator. This is moving forward in the right way, knowing there's consequences if you do not. So yes, and I mean, personally, my view is that the environmental regulatory system needs a look at.
We are out of time, but we've got 3 members with burning questions. I'm going to ask the members to please ask them very succinctly, or I'll rule you out of order. And could we have really succinct answers, please? I'll go first to Shannon Halbert.
Thank you. In the opening remarks, I heard that at this point you're willing to co-design with Māori. And I'm just interested in that particular point, because we have had submissions that have come forward to say that councils within your collective don't have effective relationships with their mana whenua, iwi, hapu and whānau. So I'm interested, why at this point are you only actioning, is that action taking place?
Well, to be honest, most of our councils, all our councils have existing relationships and have had for many years, and I can speak for my own council that does, and we genuinely value greatly our relationship. What we're saying is, in this particular model,
the point is on co-design, please. I'm asking about co-design. What
we're saying under our model, we would genuinely like to sit down with our local iwi and develop that together. Have that.
And why are you only actioning at this point?
Well, we're not, because actually a number of us have already had this in place for considerable time, where we've had involvement. So it's actually probably just codifying something that's already in place. Calling it by a label doesn't change the fact that we've already had this in place for some time.
Going to stop that line of stopping that line of questioning now, Shannon. Thank you. Going to Honourable Eugenie.
Thank you. And can I thank Communities for Local Democracy for the huge amount of work that you put into your submission and your analysis. In terms of improving future access to finance, which of the 4 tools, relaxing debt caps, revenue bonds and water financing facility and changing the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act, do you see as the most critical?
Well, I think looking at alternative financing mechanisms like revenue bonds would be a sensible first step. You could, and we haven't talked, that's just financing, and that's without changing fees and charges. So yeah, I think revenue bonds would probably be somewhere to start.
Thank you for that. I think we'll just go straight to Simon Court. Sorry, Eugenie, we are out of time. So Simon, very brief, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. How long should Tamata Arawai be given to prove it's working before we go to the next stage of water reform? Because that seems to be the issue that Malcolm has raised. And I guess we've got this new regulator. I don't think it's going to deliver its first report till 2024.
Well, we would say that that's a reasonable time frame, which then enables those meaningful conversations to happen within our communities, across councils, and to develop a genuine partnership. What we're saying to the government very clearly, and to you as select committee members, there's a better way, and we are sitting here ready and willing to partner. We don't have to rush this through. There is an alternative model that we've proposed here that will deliver the same outcomes and ensure that the reform is enduring and not something that lasts just only a political cycle. This needs to last for a long time if it's to be enduring and to get the benefits that we all want. We all want the same thing, actually, but the entity-based model is not the way to achieve it.
Thank you very much, Communities for Local Democracy. Thank you for your detailed submission and for travelling and for answering our many
Thanks for your
questions.
time.